Thank you for coming, and those of you who are just joining us, welcome to the keynote address of the 13th Annual Midwestern Undergraduate Philosophy Conference. I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker in just a moment, but I wanted to take the opportunity to thank the Creighton University Philosophy Department and Creighton Student Union for giving us a good deal of support. I apologize, I have a cold and cold medicine, for giving us support to make the conference possible. And I also would like to acknowledge the Phi Sigma Tau officers who are the students really responsible for planning the conference. Britt, Chris, Randall, Anthony. I think that they deserve some recognition. And thanks to all of you who traveled here from distances, especially those of you who are giving papers. We had a lot of wonderful student papers this afternoon and some good discussion, which will continue here. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. David Barnett of the University of Colorado, Boulder, who will be speaking to us today about truth and counterfactuals.
Thank you.
So he said in this moment.
Thanks very much for having me out, by the way. I've had a lot of fun. And I think you all are setting a good example for professional philosophers, so I hope you're going to use this video as an instructional video to philosophy professors when they go to conferences. This is a much better conference than the conferences they typically have. People here are open-minded, they're very relaxed, thoughtful, everyone's polite to each other. It's quite nice. You actually make progress. I feel like progress was made in several of the talks. That doesn't happen, unfortunately, in most professional philosophy talks. So it's been really nice. Thanks. All right, so what's a counterfactual? A counterfactual is a claim or a statement not about how things actually are, but about how things would have been if the world had been different in some way. And why are counterfactuals philosophically important? At least 3 or 4 reasons. First reason, we use counterfactuals in ordinary reasoning throughout our day. So for instance, right now, I infer that Mr. T has not been here. Why? Because if Mr. T had been here, you would all be smiling. And so that's the sort of reasoning we use throughout the day. That's the first reason it's important to understand what counterfactuals are, how they work. The second reason is that counterfactuals are central to a lot of scientific reasoning. Here's an example. We conclude that there's no electron in the cloud chamber. Why do you conclude that? Because there's no streak in the cloud chamber. And if there had been an electron in the cloud chamber, there would have been a streak. So scientists are using counterfactuals all the time. Ordinary people are using counterfactuals all the time. And then as philosophers, we're using counterfactuals quite a bit. So as philosophers, we're typically interested in the essences or nature of things. And so when you're investigating the nature of something, you're not just concerned with the actual world, how it happens to be. You want to know about all possible worlds, other ways the world could have been, and how this thing would have been in different circumstances. So for instance, you might ask the question, if the sperm and egg from which you actually originated had not met up, maybe your parents, a different sperm and a different egg from your parents formed a zygote instead of the sperm and the egg from which you originated. Had that happened, if that had happened, would you exist today? They could have named the child, they could have used the same name to name that child. That child could have even looked a lot like you, could have even grown up to be a philosopher like you. But would that have been you? I think we're inclined to say no, that wouldn't have been you. There you learned something about your essence. Maybe it's essential to you that you come from the actual egg and sperm from which you did originate. So that's the third reason counterfactuals are important. They're important for philosophy, per se. Fourth reason is that reasoning about counterfactuals helps us to reason about stable features in the world and stable connections. So why did I conclude that Mr. T hasn't been here? Well, because I'm confident that if he had been here, you would all be smiling. Why am I confident that if Mr. T had been here, you would all be smiling? Well, because I'm confident that there's a stable connection between Mr. T and people smiling. Mr. T makes people smile. He causes people to smile. And so that's a causal connection. They're not always causal connections that we're investigating with counterfactuals, but that's one of the most important connections. And some philosophers have thought that you can actually understand causation in terms of counterfactuals. So David Hume, more recently David Lewis, actually gave analyses of causation in terms of counterfactuals. By contrast, when we have low confidence in a counterfactual, that may reflect that you don't have confidence in a stable connection between two things. So you're not very confident that, I don't know, if I were to lose my fanny pack, I would be a better philosopher. Why? You don't see any strong connection between my fanny pack and my being a good philosopher. Maybe you're confident that if I were to lose my fanny pack, I'd be more popular. But I'm not going to be any better of a philosopher, right? Okay, so those are reasons to get clear on the nature of counterfactuals. The question here is, what exactly, or a question, what exactly are we saying when we say things like, if Mr. T had been here, everyone would be smiling. So what is it that we're claiming when we make these counterfactual claims? And under what conditions are these claims true? So that's my topic for today. Under what conditions is one of these claims true? All right. Talk is by David Barnett. And I'm sort of inspired by the last talk I went to on poetry and its role in philosophy to give a sort of non-standard methodology here. So I'm not going to use evidence or appeal to arguments or reasons today. And I'm also not going to appeal to poetry. I'm going to defend my view with a series of clicks and whistles and beeps. You guys ready? And a cluck. All right, that's not good. All right, so here we go. An argument. Well, I'll tell you what I'll argue for with respect to this question of under what conditions is counterfactual true. So in 1974, Philippe Petit, he and some of his buddies snuck up onto the roof of the World Trade Center. They were able to get a 450-pound cable across from the roof of one of the World Trade Center buildings to the other. Secretly, they did this. It's pretty amazing. And then Philippe proceeded to walk out onto this cable with no safety gear, so there was no net beneath him. He didn't have a helmet. He wasn't connected to the wire at all. He's a quarter of a mile above paved ground. All he had was a balancing bar. And he walked back and forth on this cable for about 70 minutes before members of the NYPD opened fire. That's not true. None of you have seen the documentary? Yeah. They didn't shoot him. All right. But 70 minutes before he was arrested. So he came off the wire, he was arrested, and got in some trouble, and they told him not to come back to the U.S. again. So the question arises, of course, what would have happened if he had fallen? That's the question I want to focus on for a little while. Raise your hand if you're at least 95% confident that if Philippe had fallen, he would have died. So I'm with you. We're all together here. Except for you? 92% confident?
A chance to grab the wire, and it could still constitute a fall.
Okay, thank you.
That was a click.
Thank you. Right. If he had fallen and not had a chance to grab the wire, he would have died. So hereafter, that's what I mean by this. Okay, now we're all together. If he had taken a real good fall. All right. So we're at least 95% confident that if he had fallen, he would have died. It looks like we've learned something already then about the conditions under which a counterfactual statement are true. It looks like for a counterfactual to be true, it's not required that the antecedent, that's the if part, entail or require the consequent, that's the then part over here. So if I ask you right now, does his having fallen entail, metaphysically require, that he would have died? And I think the answer is no, clearly not. So there are any number of metaphysically possible scenarios in which he had fallen past the wire and still not died. They're just very unlikely possibilities. So for instance, the perfect gust of wind could have, it's metaphysically possible, it could have materialized and brought him to a gentle landing right at the last moment. Right, people whose parachutes don't open have occasionally lived when they've jumped out of a plane. So very rarely. but it happens. All right, so it looks like we've learned one thing already. The truth of a counterfactual doesn't require that the antecedent entail the consequent. And by entail, I mean metaphysically require, in the way that being made of water entails being made of H2O. Right? It requires it, metaphysically requires it. Being the number 2 entails being even. Falling out of a plane does not entail getting injured, though it makes it extremely likely. Okay? So that's what I mean by entails. All right. So it looks like we've already found a counterexample to this principle, which I call counterfactual entailment. According to this principle, counterfactual is true just in case its antecedent entails its consequent. Looks like this is too strong. It may be that if an antecedent entails a consequent, that's enough or sufficient for the truth of a counterfactual, but it's not necessary. And all the standard accounts, or most of the standard accounts of counterfactuals, agree. So in standard accounts, it's not necessary that the antecedent entail the consequent for the counterfactual to be true. So what I'm going to argue today is that this principle is actually correct. So I'm going to defend this principle, even though I just gave what appeared to be a counterexample to it, and I raise my hand with you. So I'm going to give an argument in favor of this principle, and then I'll explain why it appears to have counterexamples, why we're misled into thinking that it's a false principle. So first, the argument. Now, we're all familiar with the practice of supposing something, and then in the context of that supposition, asking various questions, making certain statements, evaluating those statements in certain ways. So right now, I could ask you to suppose that Philippe had fallen, seriously fallen. So we all suppose that, and now we can ask certain questions in this context and make certain statements. So someone might say, I wonder if it would have been a sad day. And someone else says, I wonder whether he would have died. Someone else says, I wonder whether he would have still been arrested. So we raise these questions in the context of supposing something, and then certain people make certain claims. Someone says, he would have still died, it would have been sad, and so on. And then, in addition, we evaluate those claims. Someone else says, that's true, that he would have been, that he wouldn't have survived. Someone else says, that's very likely, or maybe that's vague or indeterminate. So you can evaluate the claims in the context of a supposition as true or false or indeterminate or likely or unlikely. Okay. So the question arises, under what conditions is it objectively correct to evaluate one of these claims as true? All right? So we suppose something. In that context, someone makes a claim. We suppose that Philippe had fallen. Someone says he would have died, and someone else says that's true. I want to know under what conditions is that objectively correct to evaluate that claim as true. So the answer to this question will provide the materials for an argument for this preceding principle, an argument that the truth of a counterfactual requires an entailment from the antecedent to the consequent. So this is what I'm going to talk about for a little while. We're going to suppose something, that A had been the case. In that context, we're going to consider the claim that C, A is for antecedent. Relative to the supposition, someone makes a claim that C would have been the case, so C is for consequent. And now I want to ask, under what conditions is this claim here true? Okay? So in my experience discussing this topic, I found that it's easiest for people to identify these conditions, not directly by considering this question, but indirectly by considering an equivalent question. Here's the equivalent question. Suppose that somebody bets that C would have been the case. I want to know, under what condition is that a winning bet? Surely it's a winning bet just in case what they bet on is true. So it's equivalent, this question, but for some reason psychologically I find it's much easier for people to first answer this question, what does it take for a bet that C would have been the case to be a winning bet? And then we'll come back and say, well, it's the same conditions for it to be true. But let's first answer that question. All right. So let's apply it to our example here. What we're supposing is that Philippe had fallen. The claim that somebody's making and somebody is betting on is that he would have died. In fact, let's just go ahead and do that. I will bet against this, so I'll bet $1. Is Britt here? You got a chance to make your dollar back. I'll bet $1 against this claim. So I'll bet that he wouldn't have died. Will you bet me that he would have died?
Yeah, sure.
All right, we're on. So we've made our bet, and the question here is, under what conditions does Britt win? So that's the question. Under what conditions is this a winning bet? The question is not, how do we know who won? So it's not an epistemic question. It's, what does it take? Like, what condition does the world have to be in for her to have the winning bet? That's the question. All right. Well, to answer that question, we have to have an account of what it takes to win a bet, right? So I'm going to briefly give that account, and then we'll come back and answer the question. So in general, a bet that S, so a bet that the Broncos will win the next Super Bowl, or in this case, a bet that he would have died, is a winning bet just in case, what's the obvious trivial answer? Just in case what you bet on is true. But that's not going to help us. I said I'm deliberately moving away from truth to talking about winning bets for a little while, and then we'll come back to this. So I'm not going to use that. I'm going to give a slightly different account, even though that's correct. And the account I'm going to give is illustrated with the following example, I think. So consider a little dispute between Betty and Nancy. Betty and Nancy are arguing over whether any hamsters have blue eyes. And Betty, she's confident that some hamsters have blue eyes. Nancy, on the other hand, is confident that no hamsters have blue eyes. So they make a bet, $100. Betty bets that some hamsters have blue eyes, Nancy bets that no hamsters have blue eyes. And then a couple days later, Betty comes to Nancy with a hamster physiology book and says, "Give me my money, Nancy." Nancy says, "Well, why?" Betty says, "Well, look in this book. This book talks about the physiology of hamster eyes, and it's clear from these physiological facts that it's extremely likely that some hamsters do have blue eyes." That's what Betty says. And Nancy says, "Well, look, I agree that this book is a good book, and these are facts, and I agree with you that it does make it highly likely that some hamsters have blue eyes. That doesn't mean you won the bet, because we didn't bet on whether it's highly likely that some hamsters have blue eyes, right? We bet on whether some hamsters have blue eyes. So Betty, what you need to do to establish that you won the bet is bring me some facts that settle not just whether it's highly likely that some hamsters have blue eyes. They've got to settle whether some hamsters have blue eyes, right? And in fact, they have to settle that some hamsters do have blue eyes. All right. So in order for a bet to be a winning bet, it's got to be the case that it's settled. And by settled, I don't mean epistemically. Again, it's not that we have to find out. The world settles that S in the way that my hair condition settles whether I'm bald. It settles that I am bald, fortunately. All right. So is this a good answer to the question? S is the winning bet, just in case it's settled that it's highly likely that S? No. Oh. Bad answer. How about this? It's settled that S, and by settled we don't mean epistemically settled, we mean the world makes it the case that S. Something makes it the case that S. So that's the right answer. Okay. So let's apply this to an example involving counterfactual suppositions, where we suppose something and then we consider a counterfactual claim in that context. So let's suppose that Anne here had yesterday or earlier today drawn randomly from an urn containing 99 red balls and one black ball. Okay? And I'm not talking about any particular urn, just suppose that she had drawn randomly from some urn or other containing 99 red balls and one black ball. And now let's consider the claim that she would have drawn red. That's the claim that we want to consider. And I will bet, because I like a long shot, I took a long shot with Britt, I'll take another long shot. I will bet that she wouldn't have drawn red. $1. Does anyone want to bet me that she would have drawn red? Please, so we can move forward. Thank you, Anne. $1. So I've got two bets going. Anne bets that she would have drawn red. We want to know, under what conditions does she win the bet? By the way, I'm just going to briefly pause here. It's not incoherent or totally bizarre to be betting on these counterfactuals. So here's an example where it's clearly okay. If I say to you, suppose that the number of planets in our solar system had been greater than the number of people in this audience who think I'm crazy. I'll bet you that that number would have been greater than 9. Right? That's a totally legitimate bet, and we can figure out who wins the bet. So it's not as if betting on these things is just, it's incoherent or we can't understand what it is to bet on these sorts of counterfactuals. We can understand it. It's a little strange what we're doing here. I'll explain why it's strange later. But all right, so back to this bet. Anne bets that Anne would have drawn red. I bet she wouldn't have, and we want to know under what conditions does she win her bet. Okay, so that's the question. Well, Anne comes up to me and she says, "Give me my money." And I say, "Well, excuse me?" She says, "Give me my money." I say, "Why?" And she says, "Well, look, just from the setup of this supposition, it's clear that there's 99 times more ways in which I could have picked a red ball than ways in which I could have picked a black ball. So it's 99 times more likely that I would have picked a red ball. So it's 99 times likely that I would have drawn red. That's highly likely, so give me my money." I get that phrase, I think, from a rap song. Do you guys know that song? Give me my money.
Wu-Tang.
It's the Wu-Tang Clan. I have a funny anecdote about Wu-Tang Clan. I didn't know that. RZA's from Wu-Tang, right? Do we have time for a quick anecdote? It'll just cut away from question time, which is fine. So, from objection time. Here's a quick anecdote. A friend of mine, he produced all the music videos for a while for Virgin Records. So he did all their music videos. And he was talking to RZA from the Wu-Tang Clan about a video that they were going to make. And he calls RZA and he says, "RZA, I just want to clarify for this video we're working on. First time I talked to you, you said you wanted it to be like a Christmas story." And RZA says, "Yeah." He says, "Well, okay, second time I talked to you, you said you wanted it to be like a Grinch who stole Christmas, or the Grinch who stole Christmas." And RZA says, "Yeah." And so my friend says, "Well, those are really different movies. I mean, a Christmas story is like a very realistic, serious, black and white movie. A Grinch who stole, or the Grinch who stole Christmas, that's like a fun, Disney, colorful, zany movie." And RZA says, "Yeah, hook me up." Anyway. So, back to this. Right, so Anne says, "Give me my money." And I say to Anne, "Look, when I made the bet, I agreed on these facts that you just pointed out to me. Of course I knew that it's 99 times more likely that she would have drawn red than that she would have drawn black. I knew that all along. That's why I took the bet. I like a long shot." But in order for Anne to establish that she's won the bet, she needs to do more than just bring me some facts that settle whether it's highly likely that she would have drawn red. Right? She needs to bring me some facts that settle that she would have drawn red. Okay. So if something settles that it's highly likely that she would have drawn red, no, that's not enough to settle that she would have drawn red. So under what conditions is red a winning bet? Something must settle in a metaphysical sense that Anne would have drawn red. All right. So let's bring this back to our original example and answer our question about winning bets. Here's our example. We're supposing that Philippe had fallen, and I bet Britt that Philippe wouldn't have died. She's betting that he would have died. We want to know under what conditions does she win the bet. Clearly, it's not enough that something settles that it's highly likely that Philippe would have died. In fact, if Britt comes to me and says, "Give me my money," I say, "Why?" She says, "Well, look, I did some investigating, some deep, deep investigation of what was going on that day. And I looked at the meteorological conditions. There was no gust of wind hiding around the corner from that building. I looked around for little magic leprechauns that could have, made a magic pile of feathers appear right as he was about to hit the ground. There were no magic leprechauns that day. There was no gust of wind around the corner. Conditions were normal. I even did a physiological investigation of Philippe. He had normal physiology, so he wasn't made of steel or titanium or anything like that. I looked into all these facts. So, given these facts, it's extremely likely that he would have died." And I say, "Britt, I agree with you. That's why I took the bet. I took the bet because I like a long shot. In order, though, for you to show that you've won the bet, you're going to have to bring me facts that settle not just that it's extremely likely that he would have died. You're going to have to bring me some facts that settle that he would have died. Right? So that's not enough. This is not enough. What needs to happen for D to be a winning bet is for it to be settled that Philippe would have died. And by settled, I don't mean that anyone finds out that he would have died. I mean that the world makes it the case that he would have died. Something in the world makes it the case. In other words, something metaphysically guarantees that Philippe would have died. In the way that my hair situation, the distribution of hair in my head, metaphysically guarantees that I'm bald. Right? It entails that I'm bald. It settles the question of whether I'm bald. It settles that I am bald. That's what I mean by metaphysically guarantees. Okay. So here we have an account of what it takes for D to be a winning bet. Something's got to metaphysically guarantee that Philippe would have died. So what are the candidates here? What could metaphysically guarantee that Philippe would have died? One thing that could metaphysically guarantee it is the antecedent. So his having fallen could guarantee that he would have died. But we reject that, right? I started off by asking you if you think the antecedent entails the consequent. And you said no. So the question arises whether something else could metaphysically guarantee that Philippe would have died. Maybe some facts surrounding, some contingent facts about what was going on that day, together even with the laws of nature. Maybe that could metaphysically guarantee that he would have died. So the answer to this question, the question of whether something else could metaphysically guarantee it, is no. And I'm going to show you why that's the answer right now. So the only thing that could metaphysically guarantee it is the antecedent, and here's why. All right. Suppose, as you already believe, that the antecedent, his having fallen, does not entail that he would have died. We already believe that, but suppose it's the case. What I'll show you is, on this supposition, nothing metaphysically guarantees that he would have died. Okay? So here's how it goes. We suppose the antecedent doesn't entail it. In other words, we suppose that it's metaphysically possible for Philippe to have fallen without having died. In other words, on the supposition that he had fallen, it's metaphysically possible that he would have survived. In other words, on the supposition that he had fallen, it's not metaphysically guaranteed that he would have died. In other words, on the supposition that he had fallen, nothing metaphysically guarantees that he would have died. It was that quick. So that's the key move in my argument here. It's an argument for, ultimately, we're not there yet, but it's an argument for the idea that a counterfactual is true only if the antecedent entails the consequent. Since that's the key move in my argument, I'm just going to go through it step by step, because this is where the whole action of my argument is. And this is what I'm arguing for at this point. I'm arguing that this is a winning bet only under these conditions. F has to entail D. And that's the only condition under which it's a winning bet. So here's how the argument went. Step by step. First step. Let's suppose, as we already believe, that his having fallen does not entail that he would have died. All right? From there we infer that it's metaphysically possible for him to have fallen without having died. This seems like a rephrasal of what we're supposing. All right? So that's the first move. Next we go from here, from it's metaphysically possible for Philippe to have fallen without dying, to the conclusion that on the supposition that Philippe had fallen, it's metaphysically possible for him to have not died, for him to have survived. So that too, to my mind, seems like a rephrasal. So each of these steps, to me at least, seems totally trivial. Okay, so here we are, getting close to the final move. On the supposition that Philippe had fallen, it's metaphysically possible that he would not have died. In other words, it's not metaphysically guaranteed that he would have died. That to me just sounds like a rephrasal too. So on the supposition that he had fallen, it's not metaphysically guaranteed that he would have died. Of course, if it's not metaphysically guaranteed that he would have died, then nothing metaphysically guarantees that he would have died. So we can just exchange the phrase not metaphysically guaranteed with nothing metaphysically guarantees. Again, sounds like a rephrasal. And there we are. What can we conclude from this? We got to this conclusion by supposing that the antecedent does not entail the consequent. Right? And so what we can conclude from this is that it's metaphysically guaranteed that he would have died, or Britt wins the bet, only if the antecedent entails the consequent. So that's the conclusion. Hence, something metaphysically guarantees that Philippe would have died only if the supposition entails that he would have died. Alright, so that's the key argument there. What are we to conclude about this bet I have with Britt? Well, she didn't win, right? Because there's no entailment there. I didn't win either, though. There's no entailment to my conclusion either. So the antecedent doesn't entail that he wouldn't have died either. So I don't win, she doesn't win. That starts to explain why it's a little weird to bet on in the first place, right? You probably thought, look, that's not the sort of bet that someone's going to win. So maybe that starts to explain it. Neither one of us wins. Let me continue the argument, though. So far, where are we at? I've argued now that when someone makes a claim relative to a supposition, a counterfactual claim, and then somebody bets on that claim, the bet is a winning bet only if the supposition entails what you bet on. All right? So here it is where we are. Under what conditions is a winning bet? I just argued something's got to settle that Philippe would have died. In other words, something's got to metaphysically guarantee it. In other words, sorry, not in other words. I've argued then that only happens if F entails D. But, of course, D is a winning bet just in case D is true, right? So now we can start backing up to the beginning to our original question. So from winning bet, let's move back to truth and say, under what conditions is D true? Well, same conditions under which it's a winning bet, and we have those conditions, just in case F entails D. So now we have the conditions under which it's objectively correct to call some claim true in the context of a supposition. We've got an answer to that question. And now all we need to do is take one more step back to a counterfactual, an if-then statement. And then we're finished. So let's do that. All right, consider the following three utterances. First, someone says, suppose that Philippe had fallen, he would have died. Next, somebody says, supposing that Philippe had fallen, he would have died. And third, somebody says, if Philippe had fallen, he would have died. To my ear, these sound almost exactly alike. In any case, it would be awfully weird and illustrate some sort of incompetency with English if somebody evaluated one of these as true and the others as false. So if I say, suppose that Philippe had fallen, he would have died, and someone says, that's false. You say, okay, and then I say, supposing that Philippe had fallen, he would have died, and they say, true. That would be pretty weird, right? It would be pretty weird to assign different truth values to these three. Whatever you assign to one, you've got to assign it to the other two, right? I think that's clear. But if that's the case, that's just another way of saying that the conditions under which three are true are just the same as the conditions under which the second part of one is true. And we already have those conditions. The second part of one is true, just in case the first part entails it. So this whole thing is true, just in case that thing entails that. In other words, the antecedent entails the consequent. So that was easy. That's the end of my argument for the idea that a counterfactual is true, just in case the antecedent entails the consequent. In other words, this is what I just defended, this principle here that appeared to have counterexamples and that none of the standard theories of counterfactuals accept. So this is a very unpopular claim in the world of philosophy, even though it's true. Were you guys not paying attention? Do you want to go through those steps again? Even though it's true. So, what's next? I need to explain away the appearance of counterexamples. Of course, right? Otherwise, we just have a tension. I would just leave you with a paradox or a puzzle. You know, on the one hand, Barnett offered an extremely convincing argument for this principle. On the other hand, we've got all sorts of counterexamples. They're so easy to come up with, so we have a puzzle. But that's not what I want to leave you with as a puzzle. I want to leave you with knowledge that this is a correct principle. So to do that, I need to explain away the apparent counterexamples. So let's do that next. The explanation. So let's start with the opening counterfactual that if Philippe had fallen, he would have died. Remember, I asked you to raise your hand if you're at least 95% confident that if Philippe had fallen, he would have died. Remember, I raised my hand with you, and I was being sincere, Anne. That's her dissertation was on sincerity. I was actually being sincere, so I wasn't trying to deceive anybody. I actually am 95% confident that if he had fallen, he would have died. What happened then was that I inferred from that that claim was true, right? So I said, it looks like we've shown that the truth of a counterfactual doesn't require an entailment. So that was the slip right there. There was a move. I said, I'm 95% confident that if he had fallen, he would have died. And then here's what I assume. Therefore, I'm 95% confident that it's true that if he had fallen, he would have died. So I left that as an assumption, and then I inferred that we have a counterexample to this truth principle. So what I'm going to do now is show you how that was a bad inference. You can't move from 95% confidence that if he had fallen, he would have died, to 95% confidence that it's true that if he had fallen, he would have died. So let's talk about that. All right, take an ordinary non-counterfactual statement, like the sort of statement that Betty and Nancy were arguing over, the claim that some hamsters have blue eyes. Suppose that somebody is 80% confident that some hamsters have blue eyes. Is this person rationally required to transfer this confidence to an ascription of truth to the thing they're confident of? So they're confident of this thing, and then you ask them, but is that thing true? And are they rationally required to say, well, it's just as likely that it's true than as that some hamsters have blue eyes? So should they transfer the confidence to the claim that it's true that some hamsters have blue eyes? Don't be weird on me and bring literature or poetry into this. Just be normal. What's the answer? Yes, right. Okay. So it sure seems like any rational person should transfer, unless they're doing something weird with this word true, right? They're being funny with it. All right, so for ordinary statements, if you're confident, however confident you are in the claim, you should be equally confident in an ascription of truth to that claim. But let's take a statement that's made relative to a supposition, because that's our subject matter, and see if the same principle of rationality holds. So let's suppose that Anne had drawn randomly from an urn containing 99 red balls and a black ball, and let's consider this claim that Anne would have drawn red. What do you commit to when you say it's 99% likely that Anne would have drawn red? Well, here, you're committing to a relationship between this thing and the thing you're supposing. What you're committing to is the idea that the thing you're supposing makes this thing 99% likely, right? You're not committing to the idea that this thing is just on its own absolutely 99% likely. That doesn't even make sense, right? You walk around saying it's 99% likely that Anne would have drawn red, and people say, if what? You say, no, not if anything, just, right? You get locked up. If you were to do that, you'd get locked up. So 99% likely, when you say that's 99% likely, you commit to a relationship between this and that, namely that this thing, the supposition, makes this 99% likely. Now I ask you what you commit to when you say that this thing is true. Well, when you say it's true that Anne would have drawn red, again, you're not committing to the idea that this is absolutely true on its own. You're committing to a relationship between what's supposed and what you're evaluating. It's the same basic relationship. Here, the idea is that what you're supposing makes this thing true, in the way that my hair situation makes it true that I'm bald. So it's a different relationship from the one of making something likely. So before, you committed to the idea that the supposition makes this thing very likely. Now you're committing to a very different idea, the idea that this thing makes this thing true. In other words, that it entails it. That's what I just argued. That thing has to entail this for truth. And of course, you can be 99% confident. Sorry. Let's move to that, actually. So what happens when you are 99% confident that Anne would have drawn red? Here, what you're committing to is the first idea. You're committing to the idea that this thing makes it 99% likely that you would have drawn red. 99% confidence goes with the idea that it's 99% likely. Okay? So here you commit to the idea that this thing, the supposition, makes the claim highly likely. Should you infer that this thing makes this true from that? No. You can commit to the idea it makes it extremely likely. You should not infer from that that it bears this other, very different relationship, that it makes it true, that it entails it. One proposition or one claim can make another claim highly likely without entailing it or making it true. And so, I ask you, should you transfer, are you rationally required to transfer this confidence? You're 99% confident that Anne would have drawn red, and now I ask you to consider whether it's true that Anne would have drawn red. You know that if you endorse this, you're going to commit to an entailment from that statement to this statement. You don't want to do that, right? Because clearly there is no entailment. This doesn't make that true, even though it makes it highly likely. And so, this transfer here, bad idea. That's not rational. However, we're conditioned to make this transfer because ordinarily we're not considering counterfactual statements. So if I had started off the top by asking you in general, can anyone find a counterexample to the following principle? However confident you are that such and such, you should be equally confident that it's true that such and such. I bet nobody would have found a counterexample because you scan your mind and just about any statement you can think of, that's a good transfer of confidence. That's rational. So we're conditioned to do this, and that's how I slipped that move by you, that invalid move at the beginning of the talk. I said, who's 90% confident that he would have died? Everyone raised their hand, and then I said, okay, so the truth, I just moved to truth, and nobody noticed, the truth of that doesn't require an entailment, because we're used to moving from here to here. Alright, I'm in fact 0% confident that it's true that Anne would have drawn red, even though I'm 99% confident that Anne would have drawn red. And this is perfectly consistent when you're evaluating a claim relative to a supposition. When I say I'm 0% confident that it's true, what do I commit to? 100% confidence that there's no entailment. That's perfectly consistent with committing to the idea that the supposition makes this claim 99% likely. So there's no inconsistency here. Alright, so that's the right degree of confidence. Alright, almost done with my explanation. So final piece in the puzzle is to explain to you a view about the nature of conditional statements, if-then statements. Counterfactuals are a type of if-then statement. On one view of if-then statements, to say that if such and such, then so-and-so, is just to say that so-and-so, that was the last part, but to say that relative to the supposition that such and such. So whenever you say if such and such, then so-and-so, you're really doing two things at once. You're expressing this supposition that such and such, so you're setting a suppositional context, and then in that context you're saying, you're making a claim. You're saying so-and-so. So you're doing just what we did for most of the betting. You're supposing one thing, and you're making a claim relative to it. That's a certain view of what we're doing when we utter if-then statements. It's actually the dictionary view. If you look this up in the dictionary, remarkably, only a couple of, well, I don't know any linguists who study conditionals who hold this view. I only know two philosophers, myself and a woman named Dorothy Edgington in England, who hold this view right now, and yet it just seems to be true, like almost truly obvious. So it's remarkable. Philosophers have to reject this view, the majority of them, because they're committed to other views of if-then. So it's a little crazy. If I had just given you this view outside the context of a philosophy talk, you'd say, yeah, teach me something interesting. This just seems, I would think. I'm telling you what you think, but I would think you'd think, yeah, of course. When you say if, it's the same as saying suppose or given. Alright, so to state that if A, then C, is to do two things. You express the supposition that A, and then you state something relative to that supposition, namely the consequent. Alright? And so the final piece in the puzzle is just to apply my explanation to if-then statements and see that this move here of being confident that if Philippe had fallen, he would have died, moving from that confidence to confidence that it's true, that's a bad move with if-then statements too. All right, so when you ascribe 99% likelihood to this claim, it's not that you're thinking there's something that is absolutely 99% likely. It looks like it because it looks like all one thing, right? The that clause encases this whole thing. So there's this illusion that you're saying this one thing is 99% likely, not relative to anything. It's just 99% likely. That's not really what's going on. What you're doing is you're saying this is 99% likely, that he would have fallen. And you're saying that relative to the supposition, that he would have died. You're saying that relative to the supposition that he had fallen. So what you're committing to is a relationship between these two. You commit to the idea that that makes that 99% likely. So there's a little illusion here. Illusion. I wish I could make my head spin out. Illusion. So, it's true. When you say it's true that if Philippe had fallen, he would have died, again, you're not committing to the idea that there's this thing that's absolutely true, not relative to anything, even though it looks like that. Really what you're doing is you're committing to the idea that this thing, that he would have died, is made true by this thing, that he had fallen. In other words, it's entailed by it. That's what making true means. My hair situation makes it true that I'm bald. So you're committing to the idea that makes that true. Okay, so we started off the talk. I asked who's 90% confident, but I bet you're 99% confident that if he had fallen, he would have died. Now, I ask you, is it rational to transfer that confidence to an ascription of truth to this claim? What's the answer that I want you to give at this point? No, that's not rational. That there is a bad move. And this begins to explain the appearance of counterexamples, because we're implicitly making this move. We shouldn't be. So in fact, I'm 0% confident that it's true that if Philippe had fallen, he would have died, even though I'm 99% confident that if he had fallen, he would have died. That would be very strange for an ordinary statement. Right? It would be bizarre if I said I'm 99% confident that Mr. T was here. I'm 0% confident that it's true that Mr. T was here. You go, what? It's just not rational. But for these claims, it is rational. So it's an exception to the rule here. Here it's okay. All right, so here's a summary of my explanation. What I'm doing is explaining why there appear to be counterexamples to the idea that I'm arguing for, that a counterfactual is true only if the antecedent entails the consequent. Why do there appear to be counterexamples? Well, because we're conditioned from experience to transfer our confidence in some claim to an ascription of truth to that claim. We're conditioned by our treatment of ordinary statements to do that, because it's a rational move usually. Okay? And we are justifiably confident in lots of counterfactuals whose antecedents don't entail their consequence. You should continue to be confident that if he had fallen, he would have died. You should be extremely confident. What you shouldn't be is confident that it's true that if he had fallen, he would have died. Okay? And so here's the explanation. We're justifiably confident in counterfactuals whose antecedents obviously don't entail their consequence. This gives the appearance of counterexamples because we mistakenly transfer this confidence to corresponding claim of the counterfactual that it qualifies as true. And then we think, oh, we've got a counterexample. It's an excusable mistake because the transfer is valid with ordinary statements, and those are the statements we're used to working with, so I'm not accusing anyone of being stupid in here. You can all get to be smart and have the correct view of counterfactuals. So that is my explanation. I've given you an argument for counterfactual entailment, and I've tried to explain away its appeal by telling you that counterfactuals, these certain sort of if-then statements, have two parts. They have a supposed part and then a claim part. And whenever you have that, your confidence in the claim can come apart from your confidence in the description of truth to the claim. So that's it. You clap now. Clapping for objections.
I almost think that what this comes down to is that counterfactuals entail the damn true, and that the statement that counterfactual entailment is true is kind of duplicitous, because I think what it's saying is that the only way for a counterfactual to be true is if it stops being a counterfactual and starts being a factual.
Oh, I see.
And I think that's a little insincere. I mean, in other words, that when you pose a counterfactual, you use subjunctives. And subjunctives involve possibilities. When you pose a modus ponens, you don't use possibility. You strip it of possibility. That's the only way it works. And it's kind of like saying, as long as we have a counterfactual which has possibility, logic doesn't apply. You have to strip it of possibility. And why not just, I mean, I think it was really interesting because I think that's kind of important, but wouldn't the conclusion really be that counterfactual entailment can't occur until it stops being a counterfactual?
So I just think there are examples of true counterfactuals. So here's one, and it really is a counterfactual. If Mr. T had been here, then Mr. T would have been here. That's true. It's as true as anything. So that is objectively true. That if Mr. T had been here, then Mr. T would have been here. Or if Mr. T had been here, someone would have been here. Or if Mr. T had been here, someone named Mr. T would have been here. Or on and on and on. You just need an entailment, right? Or if Mr. T had been here, at least one person would have been here. Those are all true. So there's lots of true counterfactuals. So I do want to allow for true counterfactuals. And they aren't about the actual world. They're about the way the world would have been. They're trivial in some. They're not always trivial, by the way, right? They can be really difficult to figure out. So if I say, if I don't know, if I hook it up with some difficult mathematical question, so I say something like, if my arm were to be hacked into pieces numbering, I don't know, something to do with pi, someone help me out here, then it would number more than, right, oh no, if the number of arms up here, arms and arm pieces, were the same as the number pi, then the number of arms up here would be more than 3 point, and I rattle off the first 20 digits. Then we've got a hard question because someone's got to figure out what the 21st digit is. So it's not always trivial. It can take some work to answer these questions, but they can still come out true, I think. And false, too. If the antecedent entails the negation of the consequent, then it's false. So if I say, if Mr. T had been here, Mr. T wouldn't have been here. That's clearly false. So it's not merely unlikely. It's 100% unlikely. And false, I think. Yeah?
Well, I like your idea of consider of those possibilities, those possible words. I do not reject to have possibility in a logical words. There are philosophers are studying possible words like magnets. They started. It seems to me, in your argument, you see, you mentioned this guy walking backwards for 75 minutes. It seems to me that thing I cannot accept is you completely take off the role of time. If you think it is okay to take off time when we consider of true or false, that's another argument. But if you allow time happen in this possible world, when we talk about possible world, we assume time stops, which is a wait. If you give me time, I can wait for 75 minutes and then I make a claim. Either I can 100% sure he will not fall, or I can 100% sure he would fall. He is fall. If you take time off, your argument stands. But if you don't allow time, it won't.
Okay, so let me try to clarify what you're saying to make sure. In my mind, I think you may be saying one of two things. So one thing you might be saying is that I'm failing to make explicit a reference to time here by saying something like, if he had fallen at 2 p.m. precisely, then he would have died. So I don't think this is what you're saying, but I'm happy to do that. So I can just add that. I'll say, if he had fallen at precisely 2 p.m. So then we're supposed to consider some possibility in which he falls at 2 p.m. Now I have to remember what I thought your actual interpretation was. Yeah, your actual intent was. Oh, sorry. So another point you might be making is that the following is correct. Suppose I say this. If he had fallen, it would have, at 2 p.m., if he had fallen at 2 p.m., it would have been either true or false that he fell. Right? So that's different. There what I'm doing is I'm supposing that something had happened, and then I'm counterfactually considering a non-counterfactual ascription of truth. So I'm saying it would have been true, and then now I'm no longer talking in the subjunctive. I say that he died. That's not subjunctive, that's indicative. So what you do, that's kind of what you were doing. You put yourself in that hypothetical, and sure enough, in that hypothetical, he either would have died or would have survived, right? That's clear. I'm 100% certain. And so I'm 100% certain that it would have been true, either that he died or that he survived. I'm with you on that. And yet still, I'm 100% confident that it is not true, and now I'm going to give you a counterfactual, that if he had fallen, he would have died. So there's a subtle, is that what you're talking about? There's a subtle distinction here. The distinction is between ascribing truth to a counterfactual, that's what the topic of my talk is, and a counterfactual which involves the ascription of truth to an indicative. And that's what you've raised, right? So the counterfactual itself is about an ascription of truth. It says, if things had happened, then it would have been true that, and then you give some indicative statement that he is wearing blue or she is dead. Am I addressing? So I was hoping it was one of those two. Yes.
Couple of things. One, if you went back through your argument, every place you had metaphysically, I wonder if it would make a bit of difference if you just took the word out.
Yeah. Oh, I'm happy to take it out as long as you guys don't interpret it as epistemic. It was just there to remind you that I don't mean someone has to find out. So we can go back to those steps.
But then I guess more to the point is, I mean, you have that in your mind anyway, and what do you mean by it? In other words, is it metaphysical? In other words, in the example you just gave, so if he fell, then you're confident that either he died or he didn't die. Now, is that...
I wouldn't put it quite that way. Oh, yeah, sorry. So that's totally indicative. That's not what I said. But if he actually fell, you mean we've all been deceived and he's dead?
No, I mean that if he fell, then either he would die or not die.
If he had fallen,
then
he either would have died or would have survived.
Is that a metaphysical truth? I mean, in other words, would that count? In other words, either you die or you live. Does that count as a metaphysical truth?
What's metaphysically settled there is that he would have either died or survived, because those are the only two choices. So what metaphysically settles that? His having fallen, right?
Well,
or you could just say
but what's
the law of excluded middle.
What assures us that those are the only two choices?
Oh, I see.
Well, what
I
about
was just thinking logic.
If he had fallen? How about something like if he had fallen, his body would have had some color. Is that true?
Where does every object have to have some color?
That's what I'm asking you.
Oh, I mean that's a deep metaphysical question. Is white a color?
I know your whole argument turns on. We can know what it means by metaphysically. That's the point of my line of questioning.
So if he had fallen, his body would have had some color. And I say, well, that's true only if something settles that his body would have had some color.
Right.
What are the candidates for settling it? Well, here I argue the only candidate is the antecedent entail it. But really what I've suppressed, maybe this is what you're bringing out, is that it could just be necessarily true, the consequent, right? That's not quite right. It could be that logic is what settles it. So when we say either he survived or he didn't survive, either he would have survived or he wouldn't have survived, you don't have to tell me what the supposition is for me to tell you that, yeah, that's true. Whatever you're supposing is true that in that scenario, he either would have survived or wouldn't have survived, because those are the only two options. So now are you asking how do we determine what the options are? The metaphysical possibilities?
And what's sort of the range? I mean, I think, some people want to talk about that as, I mean, you know, okay, there's modus ponens, that's logical, but is that, I mean, some people would, like Moore, I think, would say something like that they're logical truths, like, that would be more a kind of material logic in a way, like this one.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have a fully general. Try case by case, like in the color answer.
You know, or if Mr. T had been in the room, he would have been in some mood or another. Is that true?
No, because he could have been dead.
If Mr. T was alive in the room.
Okay, he could have been in a coma.
And not
But is this what you want me to do, is try to search to see if it really is an entailment there or not each time? And not in a coma. Someone help me out here.
Light nap. It could have been a light nap.
Thank you, light nap.
Just
Light, non-moody nap. Is this, I mean, I would just have to take it case by case like this and try my hardest to figure out whether there's an entailment there. And it can be hard. Maybe that's what you're pointing out. It can be hard to figure out whether it is metaphysically settled. Like the color case I take is a real challenge. That's kind of hard to say, whether every object has to be colored, because it's hard to say whether...
Well, this isn't just any object. This is a human body that just fell off of a wire. You know?
Oh, you mean once it hits the ground, is
Yeah.
it what you're saying?
Yeah, that it have a color.
I mean, it's
Dead
metaphysically...
or alive, it has a color.
It's metaphysically possible, I suppose, for it to be pure black, pure white, and then I ask myself, are those colors? And it's just a hard question, whether pure white and pure black are colors. You know, we're taught that they're not, or somebody teaches us they're not. But that's a hard one, yeah?
Because you are talking about possible world. You are talking about possible. If he's possibly died, he's possibly not. Although it could be a very nice chance he would not die. So that it is also possible he fell on some like a color barrel when other people are painting.
Uh-huh.
You cannot deny that possibility. It is
can't.
possible.
Right, so that's metaphysically possible. For him to have fallen onto a big barrel of paint. And that barrel of paint on which he could have fallen could be any color, and it could have been white, it could have been black, and I don't know what to say about those two possibilities, whether those are colors or not.
I'd say they're colors.
They are? Oh, okay. Well, then the answer is yes.
Black.
Thank you. That was easy. Yeah.
What about what's not metaphysically possible?
What is not metaphysically possible? It's not metaphysically possible for 2 to have been odd, an odd number. It's not metaphysically possible for this organism here to have originated from a different sperm and egg. It's not metaphysically possible. David Matthews, are you guys familiar with him?
The band guy?
Yeah, the band guy. He asks in his song, he says, could I have been anyone other than me? Could I have been anyone other than me? The answer is no. It's metaphysically impossible for him to have been anyone other than him. So there's another one. It's definitely metaphysically impossible for you to have been Brit. You could have, perhaps it's metaphysically possible for you to have had her body and her brain, but you wouldn't have been her. You would have just been kind of like those people who took over John Malkovich's body briefly. They didn't, right? The name of the movie was Being John Malkovich, but they're not really John Malkovich. They just take over his body and brain. So lots of things. Well, it's weird to say that. Lots of things are metaphysically impossible. That's kind of a manner of speaking, right? Right.
Right.
That's like saying lots of things don't exist. It's not that there exist lots of things that don't exist. Right? Lots of descriptions which appear to pick things out don't pick things out, and lots of descriptions which purport to pick out possibilities don't. Yes.
That's the move. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about you were talking about the kind of the controversial nature of your position, and it was so convincing that I can't imagine, what that would be. I was wondering if you could.
She buys it. She buys it all day.
Yeah, that's right. It was so convincing. No, I was wondering.
Sucker! Now look at this argument. Yeah, a real argument.
I was wondering actually if you could just say a little bit more about.
Yes, the standard views.
Well, especially when it comes to the standard, the if-then statements. You mentioned that a lot of philosophers don't want to take up the suppositional view that you have because of other commitments. I was wondering if you
Right.
could say a little bit more about that background.
So sure. Let me just get to the if-then statement. So sorry, I was going to try to get to the slide that says, here we go. Oh, it doesn't have an if-then on it. It has the word counterfactual though. Right. On standard views, and this holds not just for subjunctive conditionals, this holds for indicative. So here's an indicative conditional. If Philippe Petit did actually fall off the wire, right, then most likely he's dead, and most likely there was some sort of cover-up, right? That's different. We're not talking about what would have happened had the world been different. We're actually considering the epistemic possibility that this really did happen. So that's an indicative conditional. Standard views of indicative and subjunctive conditionals are that to say that if such and such, then so and so, is to say something not relative to any supposition or hypothesis, but categorically, just absolutely. So it's just like when you say that Mr. T was here, or that snow is white, and so on. You're just stating something. That's all you're doing. It's not relative to a hypothesis or something like that. And so, on these views, here's a couple of the standard views. So the most widely known view of counterfactuals is the Stalnaker-Lewis possible worlds account. Robert Stalnaker at MIT, David Lewis just died a few years ago. Roughly on that view, to say that if A had been the case, then C would have been the case, is to say that in the nearest possible world in which A is the case, C is the case. That's a categorical claim. That's not a claim made relative to any supposition. That's an absolute claim. You're saying in the nearest world, that means I'm not supposed to do it subjunctively. That means you go to a possible world that's as close to our world as possible, so it's very similar to ours, in which A had been the case, and you look in which A is the case, and you ask whether C is the case there. That's an absolute question there. So that's the standard view. In fact, I often believe that this is the most widely held false philosophical view in philosophy, because people hold this view in ethics, they hold it in epistemology. People who aren't working on counterfactuals are all trained now in graduate school in philosophy that a counterfactual is true just in case in the nearest possible world in which the antecedent holds, the consequent holds. They're all trained to do that, so now they talk that way. In their papers, they just translate it. They don't even say if A had been the case, C would have been the case. They say in the nearest possible world in which A is the case, C is the case. And that's false. That's the wrong view. So how do we distinguish between that view and my view, the suppositional view? On that view, it predicts that this rule about degrees of rationality is a good rule. So that view predicts that if you're 99% confident that if Philippe had fallen, he would have died, you are rationally required to be 99% confident that it's true that if Philippe had fallen, he would have died. Why? Because there's just one thing there that you're confident in, so there's no opportunity to take two different commitments about relationships between two things. On my suppositional view, when you're 99% confident that if he had fallen, he would have died, you commit to a relationship between two things, what you're supposing and what you're evaluating, and then when you ascribe truth to that thing, you commit to a different relationship, and that's consistent. According to them, there's not two things. There's not a thing you're supposing and a thing you're evaluating. There's one thing. If you're confident in one thing, you're committed to the truth of that thing, right? You're not committed to a relationship about anything. So the difference starts to come out, but that's just one difference. There turns out to be lots and lots of predictive differences between the suppositional view and the standard views. They just make all sorts of different predictions. If we have time, you guys are interested, I can give some others. It's actually an interesting literature for that reason, that it's so easy to just generate different predictions from these two theories and test them really easily. We just ask which one has the right result. Again and again, it's one of the two views. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just, this is probably a very poorly formed question, but I'm wondering whether there's a problem in understanding the antecedents if you were to isolate it as an atomic statement. So in other words, so your example was, so the for it to be an example of a counterfactual claim is, if Philippe had fallen, then Philippe, would have died. But if we isolate the antecedent,
like this, that Philippe had
that
fallen.
doesn't run grammatically today, because your example is 1974. So let's, right? So we wouldn't say Philippe had fallen. We would say Philippe fell. And then we're getting out of the subjunctive mood, right?
I think I see what you... Can I try to reformulate? If
Please.
you had formulated your question differently, I think you would have said that I'm somehow assuming that you can pull apart the antecedent and the consequent, and that they can stand on their own somehow. But they can't stand on their own. It makes no sense to just walk around saying things like, that Philippe had fallen. Or Philippe, well, that's confusing the past tense with the subjunctive. It turns out had is both past and subjunctive. So if I say Philippe had fallen, can you just say that on its own?
That's what I'm asking.
Quite do that. Yeah.
I mean, as a language user, I would say no. You wouldn't say Philippe had fallen. You would say he fell.
It's even more, what you're saying is even more clear in the case of the present subjunctive. So I say, if Mr. T were here right now, we would be smiling. I can't just say, Mr. T were here right now. That's not grammatical, right?
You take it off on your student's paper if they
Yeah, definitely. I put a big X on the front of it and I say, this is not philosophy. I crumple it up and throw it. So I fully agree with you.
Sorry.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. These are not standalone components. To say that they're separate is not to say that they stand alone. So what we're doing when we suppose counterfactually, we're doing this in both cases, but when we suppose counterfactually, it's just part one of a speech act or an act. You suppose something, and whenever you suppose something, that's just the beginning of it. You're setting the context to do something else. So you're setting the context to make some other claim, to consider a question, and so on. And so it makes no sense to just utter this sentence. Another way of putting this, what your worry is, this sort of thing that we're supposing that Philippe had fallen, it's not the sort of thing that could be true or false. So this, you can't say it's true that Philippe had fallen, or it's false that Philippe had fallen. It's not that sort of thing.
Right.
But it is the sort of thing that can be supposed. I can do it, and I can ask you to do it. Suppose that thing. Easy enough. So to deny that it's the sort of thing that can be true or false and stand on its own is not to deny that it exists, or to point out something's wrong with it. It's just to start to point to the fact it's a special kind of thing. It's the thing that can only be supposed. It's not the sort of thing that can be believed or true or false or hoped. You can't hope that Philippe, in the past tense, if you switch to past, you can hope that he had fallen.
Well, right, so that when you say the antecedent entails...
You could wish that he had fallen, sorry.
Right, so in the previous slide, when you said the antecedent entails the consequent.
Yeah. Oh, that's what you're getting at.
Right, because it's the whole conditional that's either true or false. The whole
No.
conditional. And that is a relationship between the antecedent and the consequent in states of affairs in the world, or possible states
Can
of
I
affairs.
ask, are you worried that the definition of entailment is impossible for one to be true without the other? And so when I say the antecedent entails the consequent, is you're worried, no, that can't be, because it's not the sort of thing that can be true.
Right, in that example, neither has a truth value, it seems.
Right.
Philippe had fallen is improperly formulated. Philippe would have died all by itself is improperly formulated.
I agree,
So you
and I
can't-
agree. So you can't say the one entails the other?
Well, I'm wondering, that's what I'm puzzled about.
Oh, that's
How
what you're worried
that
about,
entailment-
okay.
What that entailment relation really is.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so we're trained as philosophers to treat entailment. We say a premise entails a conclusion, just in case it's impossible for the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false. And so as philosophers, when you all hear the word entail, you might be inclined to say, oh, well, can that thing be true and that thing be false? Well, wait a second. That thing can't even stand on its own. We can't even evaluate that as true or false. So what's Barnett talking about entailment here? I'm not using the philosophical notion of entailment. I think it's wrong. What we were taught in grad school or undergrad, whenever we were taught this. So at the opening discussion, the examples of entailment I gave were not the sorts of things that are true and false. I said being made of water, there's being, to close out the session, right? Being is not a noun, it's true. Being made of water entails being made of H2O. To my ear, that's proper grammar, that sounds just fine. Of course, it's not true or false being made of water. Being made of water, you can't just say that, right? Being made of water. That's not the sort of thing you can state. It's not a statement, it's not a standalone proposition and so on, but it can entail something. Being made of water entails being made of H2O. Being the number 2 entails being an even number. Having had fallen doesn't entail having died. Or Philippe's having fallen does not entail Philippe's having died. So I really think the proper relata of the entailment relation are something like states of affairs, not ideas or truths that were taught in philosophy class or the proper relata. So they can be too, but what entails, the sorts of things that entail other things are, like having this hair condition entails being bald.
So entailment. So is your view then that entailment is a metaphysical relation and not a logical relation?
It depends what logic is, but maybe, yeah. If logic is defined as you're imagining it, then yes. It's a metaphysical relation. So by entail, I mean metaphysically, it's a what?
As you suppose I'm imagining.
Right.
Suppositionally speaking.
Right. Yes. So by entail, I mean metaphysically require. And even if we get an indicative statement that can be true or false, like that people are in this room right now, that's the sort of thing that's true. That's the sort of thing that you think that can entail something else, right? But in English, that doesn't sound right. That people are in this room right now entails that something is in this room right now. That
So
people,
the fact that there are people in this room now
that sounds better.
entails
That sounds much better, yeah. The fact that people are in this room entails that something
if
is
it's
in this
warned,
room.
then some of us are uncomfortable.
Or you could say, right. But when it comes to the truth of the matter, you put it in terms of a state of affair. You say, the truth. It's being true that people are in this room right now entails the truth of the claim that someone's in this room. So when you switch it to to using these other locutions, they're for states of affairs, right? It's being true, that stands for a state of affairs. It's being true is a state of the world. And that sounds fine to my ear. Anyway, we're going off on a big tangent, but that's a good question. I should have addressed this, actually, when I presented entailment from the beginning. By the way, I won't be insulted if we end this before, especially given how hot it is in this room, before the allotted time. So don't feel like you have to ask questions.